Hello, public speaking students. Today we're going to learn about informative speaking. As you know, we have an assignment that is called the informative speech. So this will talk about how to prepare an informative speech and how to pick a topic effectively, how to put the main points together well, and to make sure that you clinch well as well. Informative speaking is the basis of all prepared speeches. If you're not good at informative, it's hard to be good at persuasive speaking, which is also a speech that we'll be doing in this class. Almost every speech has an informative element to it where you have to tell the audience some kind of new information. So the informative speech is the best way to start when you're learning public speaking, because once you can do informative well, then you can graduate to the next level, which is the persuasive speech, where not only do you have to inform people, but you actually have to persuade them. And we'll talk about the differences later when we get there. All persuading generally requires some kind of informing, but not all informing requires some persuading. So, let's learn about informative speaking. For definitions, informative speaking is basically for the purpose, so if we go ahead and just write this out here. So, informative speaking, the goal is to educate an audience, okay? You're educating an audience about a topic. Now, when you're educating the audience, you're serving the role as a teacher. So think of yourself as a teacher or expert when you're the speaker. Your job is to show us something or to teach us something new or to give us some kind of information that is interesting. Now, in the informative, the message that you want to get across is going to be some kind of useful information about a subject. Now, that can be something like how to pick the best kind of credit card. Because, you know, there's different credit cards with interest rates and so forth. Maybe you're going to do an informative on how to pick the best kind of credit card or how to buy a house. And then you're going to walk through the steps of like saving up for the deposit, finding a real estate agent, you know, considering property values and so forth. So that's going to be your message. Your message is going to be having some kind of set of useful information about a subject. But then you also have to think, when you're doing speeches, you're not just giving a message, you're also trying to convey some kind of emotional effect. So, generally, when you are doing informative speeches, the effect that you want to go for, the effect that you want is some kind of wow or mind-blowing or interesting effect. So what does that mean? In your speech, you want to give us useful information and you want us to feel, so you want us to think about the useful information and you want us to feel, wow, mind blown, interesting about it. So because you're going for that effect, the way you talk, the way you present, the way you move, the way you speak should be filled with excitement. And it's like as if you're about to talk about something that's really interesting because you're going for the wow, mind-blowing, interesting effect, you see? So anytime you do a speech, you can't just be focused on the message. You got to think about what kind of effect am I trying to go for? How do I want the audience to feel? And then how can I evoke that emotion while talking about the message? Now, another thing might be, well, can some informatives also be persuasive? Well, there can be some informatives that can accidentally be persuasive. For example, what if I did my informative on chocolate cake? So my informative is all about how to make good chocolate cake. And then I talk about how moist and chocolatey the frosting is and so forth and chocolate chips and blah, blah, blah. Well, probably by the end of the informative, even if I don't tell you you should all go buy a chocolate cake, you're probably going to want a chocolate cake by the end of the informative because I talked about it so much, right? But that's kind of accidental. Now, if you're going to do an informative about chocolate cake, you better bring in a chocolate cake as a prop. I mean, come on, right? But we can definitely think of really mundane topics like the history of staplers. Maybe staplers have a really interesting history. You know how complex those machines are? Like, I mean, it's crazy. That thing can only staple one at a time, and it's pretty awesome. Or how cars work, for example, or how to change a tire, where it's not a clear call to action per se, but it's just information. Now, there are two types of informatives. First, you have descriptive informatives. Now, descriptive informatives generally describe the nature, workings, or history of something. What makes something descriptive or a descriptive type informative is that it's generally going to be abstract in nature, the topic is. It's the history of the toilet. I can't hold the history in my hand, right? But I can certainly tell you about it, and I can make it interesting because I'll make the story interesting somehow throughout the informative speech. So you're describing something. You're telling us about something. You're telling us how a car works. Now, logistically, you can't bring in a whole full-size vehicle into a classroom. So you'll have to tell us about maybe how the engine works. Or you're going to tell us about how Congress passes a bill, right? You can't put that in your hands. You can't put it in a room and like, okay, I'm going to bring in all Congress and we're going to watch right now Congress passing a bill. It takes months to do that, right? So you're going to have to tell us about it. You're going to have to describe it to us. And so you're going to have to figure out how to make that interesting to an audience, because how Congress passes a bill can probably be boring in nature, but you can make it interesting as an informative if you know how to present ideas effectively. And then you have demonstrations. Demonstrations demonstrate how to do something or how it works. So what makes demonstrations is you're doing a demonstration usually live, and it's something hands-on. With a hands-on approach. When you do a demonstration, you're showing us how to do something right there on the spot in the speech. Maybe I had a student who did how to change a flat tire on a bicycle. So he brought in a bicycle wheel, he brought in a flat tire, and he showed us live how to take the tire off, how to, make sure, there was some intermediate step, and then put the next tire on, and then put air into the tire and so forth. So that's a demonstration. He didn't do, today I'm going to tell you about the history of bicycle tires and how they're made and, all this stuff. No. Just pure demonstration about how to change a bicycle tire. Now, he still had main points because the main points were divided into steps. So he had step 1, step 2, step 3. But he still had to have an intro because he wanted to tell us, why is this important to us, motivate us. And he still had a conclusion, too, because this is still a speech. Okay? So demonstrations usually start with the words like how to, and then generally that becomes a demonstration. Now, for your speeches, you're more or less expected to be doing descriptives, but you can have a demonstrative component to it, but we're expecting that your informative is a speech, right? What we just don't want is people how to make brownies, and then they're just cooking, they're just, okay, now you add salt, now you add sugar, now you add baking time. Okay, there's brownies. Okay, no, that's not a speech. So you really want to do a descriptive, informative most likely, but if you want to have one main point, where you show us something really quick, I think that's okay. Now, in terms of topics, there's all kinds of topics that you can do an informative on. Almost anything that interests you can be an informative. So when we look at topics, you can do things like objects. So you can do credit cards, you can do planets, you can do places, you can do things, you can do informatives on individuals or groups. Maybe you want to do an informative on Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or maybe you want to do an informative on the neo-Nazi movement. Okay, so that would be a group. Okay, so individuals or groups, or your favorite band. Maybe you want to do an inform on the Backstreet Boys. Okay, hey, Backstreet's still around. They're still going. Okay, cool. You can do your informative on the Backstreet Boys. You can also do it on events. So maybe there's this really cool event that you want to inform us about. In Austin, we have this thing apparently called Eeyore's birthday. And apparently, a lot of weird stuff goes on. A student who does a lot of substances tells me about these things that people do. Anyways, okay, cool. I want to do an informative on ACL. I want to do an informative on, Eeyore's birthday. Okay, cool. An event of some kind. Now, you can do it on processes. So how concretes are made. So what's the difference between ice cream and a concrete? So of course, you know it has to do with the egg consistency, but okay, you still get the idea. You can do how iPhones are produced. You can do some kind of process where how is something done, if you will, or explain a process. Or what happens in a sleep cycle. That would also be a process. You can also do an informative on an idea. You can do an informative on Murphy's Law. What is Murphy's Law? And just how the different conceptualizations of that. You can do an inform on capitalism. What are some of the fundamental tenets of capitalism and what does that mean for us today and how we make decisions? So all kinds of things can be an informative. Anything that there is a history or anything that has description to it, you can turn it into an informative. Here are some tips on picking a topic for the informative, because I've been doing this long enough now. I've been teaching it long enough. I competed. The very first speech that I competed in high school that I did well in, that I was the 3-time state finalist, was informative. Okay, and I did it in college too and all this stuff, and yeah. So here are some things that I think will help a lot of people when you're picking an informative. Okay, number one, when you're picking a topic, pick something novel. Okay, novel means something that's new, something that we haven't heard already. Okay, something that isn't cliche. You want to pick something we already don't know much about. So I always get somebody who does an informative on soccer. It's like, okay, we already kind of know soccer. Like, I mean, we all are already pretty familiar with the sport. And so it's not bad that they did their informative on soccer per se. The problem is they just do it on things that we would already know. They do, here's how the rules are played, you know, and then they do like, here's the size of the field. Well, okay, we already know that, okay? If you want to do something on soccer, do something that's new. Provide a new kind of angle, okay? So provide an angle is one of the ideas. Provide a new angle that we haven't thought about. So maybe if you decide to do soccer, okay, do it on something that's like we haven't heard before, like the history of soccer and how it used to be, practiced this particular way or something. I mean, if you're even going to do that. But try to think of something that people wouldn't know much about, but that they would also find really interesting, okay? Next, you want to find an angle on a topic that people haven't thought about. So this is another way that you can approach informative. I had a student who, what she did her informative on samurai movies. Now, at first, why should we care about samurai movies? Like, most of us probably haven't even seen a samurai movie. And we're talking about like the classical Japanese, like Japanese subtitles, all that stuff. Samurai movies, okay? Like made in the 50s and whatnot. Now, she could have just done history of samurai movies and then like a quarter of the class might have cared. But here's what she did. She started with talking about the history of samurai movies. And then her informative was really about was how Western movies stole from samurai movies. And I remember she showed Western movies, like cowboy Western movies. She showed one movie where literally like the scenes were like copies of each other, except instead of a cowboy, it was like, well, instead of a samurai, it was a cowboy walking down the street. And like, she just showed like how much of Western films were basically derivations of samurai films. And then she even went into Star Wars and how Star Wars was actually taken from some of the ideas of samurai movies. Okay, that's a whole new angle on the topic, right? So even though she loved samurai movies, she knew that we probably wouldn't care, most of us. But what she did was she turned the informative into how samurai movies have influenced Western movies. Oh, holy jeez, man. I didn't know that like Western movies were kind of just copies of samurai. So, and you might have known that either. So that's cool. That's cool. So you got to think, pick a topic that's novel and pick a topic that you can provide some kind of interesting angle on that's not just interesting to you, but also could be interesting to us. And then the third thing, and this is what always helps me in competition, relate it to everyday life. Whatever topic you pick, you want to make sure that your audience knows this is something you can use in your everyday life, or this is something that applies to your everyday life. Because the biggest thing with informative, and the biggest thing with anything that's educational, is a lot of times people check out because they don't think they need this information. They don't think this information is useful. So your biggest challenge in informative is convincing people that this is useful, or at the very least that this stuff is interesting, and that's where captivators are going to come into play a lot. So try to find ways to take your audience and say, here's how this particular idea, or how this particular event, or how this particular thing relates to your everyday life, and try to bring it down to that level. That's big. That's big. And then always try to show where you can. So for these informatives, at least for my class, you're not allowed to have electronic visual aids, but you can have props. If you can bring in a prop or show a prop that can help illustrate an idea, do it. So if you're doing your informative on roller skating, bring in some roller skates. I mean, come on. You know, if you're doing on roller derby. In fact, I had one student who did that. She did her informative on roller derby. Not all of us know what a roller derby is and how it works. And she even brought in her roller skates and she even skated around and stuff like during it. And that was cool. That was cool. Okay? So always try to show instead of just tell. Okay? So 4 big things there. Okay, now we're on to writing the informative speech. We're going to go back to the sandwich. Remember the sandwich from the speech writing lectures? Well, now we're going to come back to that because now that you have a contextualized speech here, there's going to be some things that you're going to want to make sure you do. And we're going to start with the introductions first. So as you know, an introduction in a speech, of course, includes 4 things generally. First, you always have your attention getter, right? And hopefully you know what an attention getter is now and what some good examples are of good attention getters. You should not be starting with, I'm sorry, I'm not good at public speaking. Nope. If you start with, I'm sorry, or any kind of apology, you lose points, tons of points. If you start off with, hi, my name is John. We already know your name is John, so that's not an attention getter, okay? So start with a good attention getter, start strong, grab our attention, throw us into the pool, okay? Then, of course, you want to have your tie-in. So depending on how far off your attention getter is from the thesis, you might have to take a moment to tie it in. Then you have your thesis, okay? Now, one thing that I highly, highly recommend and almost require to a certain degree is that when you write a speech, you should always be able to say the point of your speech in 10 words or less. So you prepare this 7-minute speech. You should be able to tell me the main point of this speech with 10 words or less. I used to say 1 sentence, but then you'd have people who come up with these long compound sentences with semicolons and ands and all these things. So then their compound sentence is actually 5 individual sentences, okay? What's your speech in 10 words or less? What's the point? What's the one thing you want me to take away from this speech in 10 words or less, okay? That's your thesis, okay? And you want that to stick. And then, normally, you have your preview of main points. Now, you already know this, attention getter, tie-in, thesis, preview. What I'm going to add with the informative speech, there are 2 other things that I think you should do to make sure that your informative is going to be something, especially the intro, we really want that to be, really strong, okay? Somewhere in here, and I don't have a set area where this happens. I think it should happen before the preview, though, and obviously before the attention getter. So somewhere in this area, there's 2 more things that you got to do. And actually, well, within this area, there's going to be one thing, and then within this area, so there's one thing you definitely got to do within this area. Let's start there, and then I'll say what the second thing you got to do. One thing you need to add somewhere in here is motivation. Motivation is basically telling your audience why this topic is important or has value to them, okay? So motivation is basically, here's why you should care about this topic. Part of public speaking is indeed talking about things that you care about. But public speaking is also a gift to the audience. Public speaking is for the audience. It's not for yourself. It's for them. So you have to explain to them, why is this particular speech topic a gift to them, okay? Now, sometimes that might be self-evident, and you might not have to say much. But for this assignment, you got to have at least 1 sentence, at least 1 statement in your intro that explains why this is important to them. Now, to motivate your audience, you have to somehow tie it to their needs, their interests, or their concerns. So there's 3 different types of motivation that you can use to get there. The first is practicality. You can just argue that this information will be useful for practical reasons. Now, so an example might be something like, if you do your speech on how to change a bike tire, well, then it's a practical motivation. It's important for us to learn about how tires are changed because one day you might have to be able to do this yourself when your tire goes flat on Barton Creek Greenbelt, you know, that kind of thing, okay? So practicality is basically, you should listen to this because it's useful. Like, you can actually use this information to go out and do X, Y, and Z. Secondly, there is awareness. When you argue awareness, what you're arguing is that this information will expand your awareness about something so you can act accordingly or start preparing accordingly. For example, if you're doing your speech on, let's say, the flu virus, and you're going to do about how the flu spreads, why it spreads, and what you can do to prevent yourself from being affected by the flu, then you can argue in the introduction, in terms of motivation, awareness. It's important for us to be aware of the flu because it's currently spreading, and there's a lot of information that you can have to help you prepare for a future outbreak or whatever, okay? So awareness is a motivation, right? It's telling you, it helps you get ready. It puts something on your radar to be prepared for whenever X, Y, and Z happens. And then lastly, you have appreciation. Let's say you're doing the history of jazz. Now, it probably won't have practicality, although you could argue if you say that, well, hang on a second. It probably won't have practicality unless you're making jazz music yourself. Awareness, maybe, but it's like jazz music isn't like a threat. It's not something that's growing, I don't think. Like, if you're arguing that like jazz music is coming back and you should start being aware of like what the key singers or key players are in that, then maybe you can argue awareness. But what you could really just argue is appreciation. When you argue appreciation, what you're arguing is that by knowing this information, you'll be able to appreciate jazz more. By learning the history of jazz, you'll understand where it all comes from, who the key players are, and you'll be able to understand what's going on in the music at a deeper level than if you didn't know it at all. So you're increasing the enjoyment of it because you know more about it. Make sense? So you're going to have one of these three. So part of your speech requirement for the informative is you have to use one of these three somewhere in the intro within the tie-in or the thesis. Okay, so you can do it maybe attention getter, tie-in, motivation, thesis. You can do attention getter, tie-in, thesis, motivation. But somewhere in here, you got to have motivation. The other thing you got to have, and this can be done, I think, within these three. It can be part of your attention getter, or it can be part of your tie-in thesis, is credibility. A credibility statement. With a credibility statement, you want to explain to the audience how or why you're credible on this topic. A very easy form of credibility statement is to talk about your personal experience with this thing. So if you are somebody who likes to ride your bike, maybe your introduction is going to be, every day I ride my bike on the Barton Greenbelt. And I enjoy my ride until I hear the pop. When you hear the pop, it's the sound of death. Your tire is going out. Okay, and blah, blah, blah. So then we kind of know that you are a bike rider, and then you go tie-in thesis. So today, I'm going to teach you how to change a bike tire by doing these three steps. And with my experience, you'll learn blah, 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 blah. Okay? So you can see that you tied in credibility throughout the attention getter tie-in thesis. Now, if you do some other kind of attention getter, though, where it doesn't imply that you have credibility, you might have to have a statement in there. You know, so today, based on the research that I've conducted using X, Y, and Z sources, or through my experience, teaching 300 kids about counting to 10, here's an informative on how we can improve child literacy, blah, 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 okay? So you got to have some kind of credibility statement in there. Either it's implied in the attention getter because you talk about an experience that you have, or you mention it directly, how or why we should believe you on this topic. Okay? That's that. And then, as far as main points go, so this is just your intro. Then you have your main points. In your main points, the key things are, I'm not going to go through each single main point here because that's already done in the speech writing lecture. But my tips for main points is you got to have captivators. So remember, captivators at every intro within main points. So if you don't know what a captivator is, go back to that lecture. And of course, you got to use logical ordering. So you got to use one of the orders from the main points lecture to make sure that everything flows. Okay, so we're looking for captivators and, of course, transition statements. We don't want choppy, informative speeches that just kind of go all over the place. So got to have transitions, got to have good logical ordering, got to have captivators. If you don't have captivators, you're going to lose us in the middle of the speech. An attention getter, remember, only gets your attention for about 30 seconds to a minute, and then you got to reset. So then a captivator's got to come into play. Next, we got to learn how to cite sources in a speech. This is something that's required in all the speeches that you're assigned from here on out, and you got to be able to do this correctly. You will be graded on how well you cite sources in your speech. Now, the reason we cite sources is clear. We have to be able to show that we did our research and our homework, and you got to be able to do it in a way where if somebody's listening to the speech, they can at least get an idea of where you got your information from. Now, when you're citing sources in a speech, there are three possible things that you can mention, because we're talking about orally citing a source here. We're not talking about written citations. When you're orally citing, you can either mention who said it. Okay, so if you're citing an author, Sam Harris wrote in his book, blah, blah, blah. Okay, you know, Sam Harris said, okay, that's a who. Then, here, who and through what medium would be your second. Okay, so this would be something like, you know, was it a book, interview, and a blog, etc. And when? What date? What year? Now, here's the idea when you're citing sources in a speech. Anytime you cite sources, you have to mention at least two of these. So if you want to say, Sam Harris wrote in his book, I don't know his name of his books, but Becoming God, that blah, 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 blah. Okay, great. You said who and through what medium, his book. You could do something like Socrates said in his book, The Dialogues, blah, 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 in the year, you know, you don't have to say the year, but you said two right there, that's fine. If you're doing like an association, you could say the Union of Concerned Scientists wrote in a report on December 15, 2009, blah, 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 blah. Okay, then you hit all three. But what you can't just do is like, Paul Rumsfeld said, well, when did Paul Rumsfeld say that? And through what? Or through when? Okay? We don't have any context of when Paul Rumsfeld said what. And we don't even know who Paul Rumsfeld is. Like, who's Paul Rumsfeld? You see? So you have to do something like who said it, through what medium, and when. You want to have all three, but you got to have a minimum of at least two. So whether it's a book, a show, a website, an interview, a correspondence, you got to have at least two of these orally stated. That's another thing. When you're citing sources in a speech, you have to say, Paul Rumsfeld said on March 15th, 2018, blah, 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 blah. Okay? There we go. Then you've cited the source. I highly recommend watching the sample speech with the informative. She does a good job with the birds and the weaves. That speaker does a really good job of citing sources very formally and correctly. So if you need some examples, that's a good place to go. And we're also going to look at some examples here in a second. But you got to have at least two of these things whenever you orally cite. Having it on your slide doesn't count. So when we get to PowerPoints, well, it's on the slide. No, you got to orally cite it. So here are some examples of sources being cited. If you were orally citing a newspaper, you might say, according to the New York Times on September 3rd, 2018, unemployment will be blah, blah, blah. You have the medium, and then you have the date. Okay, that works. So now if I want to verify if what they said is true, I can just look up the New York Times, and then I can look for September 3rd, 2018. Okay, great. Then you have a book. Plato wrote in his book, The Republic, that blah, blah, blah. You know, The Republic was probably written thousands of years ago. So if you just say Plato and The Republic, okay, so then when you go to your quote here, I can just go back and look for Plato's book, The Republic. If you're doing like a media publication, you can say Michael Lindley, a neurosurgeon at NYU Hospital, said in an interview with CBS 60 Minutes on December 3rd, 2018. Here we provide the whole shebang. We provide the person. If I don't know who Michael Lindley is, here's some credibility about who that person is. And then here's the medium, CBS 60 Minutes, and here's the date. So ideally, you want all your sources to be like this, but we understand that sometimes it's not necessary to have all of that information, but you got to have at least 2. You see? So always 2 out of 3 when you cite sources orally. Now we're on the conclusion of the speech. When you do a conclusion, of course, you always want to summarize, do a summary. You want to restate the thesis. Remember, a conclusion is an upside-down introduction. I also, and then, okay, so if we do summary, restate, tie-in, and then clincher, right? And hopefully you know what a clincher is by the last speech writing lecture. So you have these 4 things. Remember, a conclusion is an upside-down introduction. Here's one difference that you'll probably do with an informative. You're going to have your summary. So today we talked about the history of jazz. We talked about first the founding of jazz, then we talked about the mid-1950s through 60s, and then we talked about jazz in its current day. Overall, we know that jazz impacts all of American culture in different ways. And by learning about jazz today, you can greatly appreciate the likes of Miles Davis and Louis Armstrong and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so here's what I did. I summarized, I restated the thesis, and I also restated the motivation. Now, I didn't put it in future tense, I put it in past tense. I basically said, your motivation for listening today is fulfilled because we learned about X, Y, and Z. We learned about the summary, learned about the thesis. So you want to somewhere in there restate the motivation or explain how the motivation was satisfied. Okay, so restate motivation, satisfaction. And then you're going to tie into your clincher. Okay, and then of course you're going to end strong with your clincher. You should never end on a summary. If you end on a summary, that's weak and you don't get points for the clincher. So clincher's got to be strong. You don't end. Thank you is not a clincher. Okay, you got to make sure you have some kind of good mic drop at the end. Okay, that's what we want. We want mic drop. So make sure you end with a good clincher. Watch the speech writing lecture to make sure you know what a clincher is. I want to now talk about delivery and give you some tips there as well. Because when I've seen people do informatives for long enough now, there are some things that always come up when I see people, and I want to make sure you don't make these same mistakes. Number 1, with informatives, vocalics. Vocalics, vocalics, vocalics. Here's the idea. Remember, you're going for the effect of this is awesome, this is cool. What I'm about to show you today is really cool. What I'm about to show you today is really awesome. What I'm about to show you today is mind-blowing, okay? Now, the problem that people face is it doesn't sound like that what they're about to show us is mind-blowing or interesting because they don't talk like it's mind-blowing or interesting. They're like, today I want to talk about the history of soccer and why soccer is the greatest sport in the world. Soccer's really interesting. Okay, no, it doesn't sound like it. Doesn't sound like it's interesting. Doesn't sound like it's cool. Doesn't sound like it's about to be something awesome here about to go on. You got to think like, what you have to do is you have to put yourself in the character or in the mode. When's a time that you saw something really cool? Just like in your own real life. Like maybe you went to Disney World or maybe you went to some cool mountain or something. I don't know. When's some time you saw something really cool? How did you sound when you went and told your friend about the thing that what you saw that was really cool? Do you go, friend, I just saw this thing really cool. It was really awesome and cool. Yeah. No, you're like, dude, bro, like yesterday I was at the store and I saw this really cool looking rock, or whatever. Like you sound excited. You sound like you're just about to tell somebody something really exciting and cool. That's how you should sound in your speech. If this is really interesting, then you should sound interesting. You should sound interested. You should sound excited. You should sound like this is the coolest thing you're about to experience in your life. If you sound monotone, if you sound bored, if you sound scared, you're not getting out that tone. And then we're not going to think, even though you're saying stuff, we're not hearing stuff because you don't sound like it, okay? So you got to say it and you got to sound it too. Make sense? Vocalics. So talk like this thing is cool. But my speech isn't that interesting. Then pick something that's more interesting, okay? Pick something that can get you in that mode where you're going to want to sound interested, okay? If your speech, if you just can't get there with this topic, it's probably the wrong topic. Pick something that can get you excited. Pick something that is going to make you talk like you're just about to show us something cool. All right, next thing. I'm not a huge fan of passing things around during speeches. So I don't recommend passing things around. Don't pass things around. Hold and walk instead. What happens is people will bring things in as props for their speech, and then they're going to want their class, like they ask, okay, now I'm going to pass around this thing. And what happens is when you pass things around, you create your own distraction, because now your audience members have to handle this thing. And like, you have one person that's looking at it, and then they have to bump the next person and say, okay, here you go. And this is all while you're talking. And then that person's getting distracted, and you're basically asking people to be distracted, to distract themselves. And then they're looking at the object and not listening to you, and that's really bad. If you want people to see something that's tiny, or you want people to have like a close-up look on something, then just carry it and bring it to them by going 3D in terms of movement. So just walk towards the audience and let them see it, okay? You can walk up and down the aisle and let them see it and get a close view that way. And then at the end of the speech, if you want to pass something around, go ahead and do it then. But don't pass things around during your speech. I don't recommend that generally, okay? And then captivators. Captivators, captivators, captivators. People still forget captivators, okay? And so I'm going to write this again because it was kind of written sloppy. Captivators, people. Captivators. What do you want? Captivators. Captivators. Okay, so remember, attention getters just one. You got to have captivator in main point 1, captivator in main point 2, captivator in main point 3. Keep the captivators coming, okay? Captivators, captivators. What are we supposed to have in our speech? Captivators, okay? So captivators. I'm going to say it again. Captivators. Have them in your speech. If you don't have captivators, not good. So in closing, pick a topic that's interesting to you that you can make interesting to your audience. So interesting to you while interesting to your audience. And sometimes something may not seem like it's evidently interesting to the audience, so you have to build that bridge. A lot of what informative is doing is bridge building, okay? My passion should become your passion, and here's why. And that's what the informative is about. So this is where an informative can kind of be like a persuasive, right? In the sense that you're trying to get people to appreciate something. You're trying to get people to learn something. You're trying to get people to be aware of something, okay? And you want to do that using the information and by presenting it in a way that's interesting and evocative. Informative is all about learning how to keep audiences' attention. That's where a lot of the focus of this speech is how can I make sure that I always keep my audience's attention, because they're always at threat of losing it every 30 seconds to a minute, okay? So think bridges. And most of all, you got to have fun with informative. I always had fun with informative. I always had a little joke in there or two in the informative, because everyone's so serious about the informative. And they're just like, I want to inform people about motors. Motors are interesting, and then it's just like, motors, don't mess around with motors, and it's just like, it's just super serious and stuff. And it's like, no, have fun. Find ways to make this relatable. Find ways to make this something that we can all appreciate and understand. So have fun with this. I mean, do the assignment seriously, but have fun with it. Make sense? If you have any questions, shoot me an email, write in the forums, and I look forward to seeing your informatives.